podcast.
I had just come back from a trip to America supporting a friend who was having top surgery. They were transitioning. And I'd found this lump before we left. And I showed a friend and she said, "Oh no, that's way too big. There's no way that's cancer." So I went on my trip and came back and decided to have it checked out. So I was sent off for an ultrasound that came back with some concerns. So then a biopsy happened. The radiologist who did the biopsy turned around to me and said, "Don't worry, I've been doing this for a long time. I've seen lots of these and that's not cancer."
This is Megan from the New South Wales far north coast. And it turns out her radiologist was wrong.
When it's breast cancer, so the results come back and, the doctor gives you the conversation, which is about, "I'm really sorry, we've got some bad news for you. I need to tell you you've got cancer. This is breast cancer." And they explain the kind of cancer that it is. So at this point, I was put in touch with a surgeon, a local surgeon, and the conversation began with her, which was, there are some decisions you need to make. And the first decision you need to make is whether you'll have a lumpectomy, which is to remove the tumour and some of the flesh around it to try and get a good clearance, or whether to have a full mastectomy.
Megan was facing one of the biggest decisions of her life. If she chose to have a lumpectomy, just the removal of the lump, she would need radiation afterwards. If she chose to have a mastectomy, the removal of the whole breast, she might be able to avoid the grueling radiation therapy.
So the challenge I found at that point wasn't, the loss of my breast. Many women do experience that, and I was really lucky that I didn't feel I was losing some significant part of my identity. To be honest, I had never loved my breast that much anyway. But what I was really concerned about was how I would live with one. We all attached to different things at the time, so I was concerned, this is embarrassing to admit, but I was concerned about my sexuality and what would happen to that part of my experience of life. I was really concerned that I might feel wrong if I was walking around with one breast.
So what did Megan choose? We'll find out a little later in the show. I'm Sana Kadar, and today on All in the Mind, we're looking at big decisions, how we make them, and how they shape us. And this story is being brought to you by producer James Bullen. Hi, James.
Hi, Sana. Yeah, most of us can expect to face tricky choices throughout our lives on everything from family to career to health. Dr. Adrian Camilleri is a consumer psychologist and a senior lecturer of marketing at the University of Technology, Sydney. And he's been looking into these big life decisions.
A few years ago, I found myself making a number of big life decisions, such as relocating across different countries, getting married, buying a house, having children, and none of the research that I'd conducted was sort of relevant to any of those decisions. And when I looked around, I didn't really find too much research that was relevant. So I thought maybe there was an opportunity there, and it kind of paired well with a question I like to ask friends at dinner parties, which was, how many of your life's 10 biggest decisions do you think you've already made? And that usually sparks a nice conversation about, well, what is a big life decision? And, when do they tend to happen during one's life? And how many have I got left ahead of me? So I decided maybe I could pursue that kind of question beyond just friendly dinner parties and see if there was some more science that could be thrown at that kind of question.
These life decisions are defined as rare events that require what Adrian calls resource investment, large amounts of money or time, and they're usually difficult or impossible to take back, like buying a new house or having a child. Adrian surveyed hundreds of people about their 10 biggest life decisions and analysed the data to find out which were the most common as well as the most important.
In terms of decision types, the most commonly mentioned big life decisions were starting a new job, getting married, pursuing a degree, having a child, and buying a home. So probably not a surprise that those come out as being fairly common. In terms of decisions that people rated most positively, these tended to be associated with what you might call self-development. So pursuing a religion or spirituality, that tends to be one that gets mentioned quite often as retrospectively quite a good decision. And I think that's interesting because a lot of the time these self-developmental type decisions, it requires you to put some time and effort into something that is perhaps not immediately important, particularly if you're kind of midlife and dealing with career, dealing with children. It's hard to set aside the time to make those self-developmental decisions, but it turns out that those tend to be the ones that people reflect on most positively.
As you might expect, self-destructive choices like committing a crime tended to be considered bad decisions after the fact. And time plays a factor too, whether it was seconds, hours, or years that people spent thinking about their choice.
In general, the decisions that participants thought about longer before making a commitment tended to be evaluated more positively, whereas the decisions that people made quite quickly, which tended to be those self-destruction type decisions, such as committing a crime, they tended to be evaluated more negatively. So in general, I guess you could have a take home, which is spending more time reflecting on a decision and thinking about the potential outcomes before actually pulling the trigger and making a decision tends to be an approach that leads to at least later positively evaluated reflections on that decision.
When Megan was diagnosed with breast cancer, time was of the essence.
Especially with fairly aggressive breast cancer, you only have a very short amount of time to make a decision because the difference between getting the cancer out before it's in your lymph nodes and it travelling to your lymph nodes, that can be quite significant in terms of the treatment that you have afterwards. So they had given me, I think, 2 weeks to make the decision. They'd booked the surgery date and I had to make the decision. But they were lovely. They said to me, you can take right up until the day of the surgery to change your mind about which surgery you're having. Anyway, it got a bit closer and I think I saw the surgeon for something and I just asked for some extra time. I was still really unsure and I was most concerned about how I would explain it to my girlfriend at the time, who we were very much in love, but she was a little bit like, maybe don't have the full mastectomy. And it matters a lot when that's your partner. And she, was very supportive through the whole process. But anyway, so I asked for some more time.
The curious thing is, at that point, Megan knew in her gut which route she would take.
I knew that I was going to have the mastectomy because living a long time was more important to me than keeping a certain amount of my breast. But that week gave me time to actually find that out, to really listen to myself and then to figure out how I was going to explain it to people. What I said to the surgeon was, I'm going to do the right thing, which I think for me, which is to have the full mastectomy, but I want you to promise me that you'll take the other one, because what I'm struggling with is the idea of living with one breast. And she said, well, I can't do that. You don't have cancer in the other one. So we made this kind of tentative agreement that when all of the treatment was finished and the chemotherapy was finished, that I would have the second mastectomy. And that's exactly what happened. She did that in the end, which was great. I think one of the difficult things about big decisions like this is big decisions don't happen when there's not much going on in your life and there's nothing at stake. Big decisions happen when there's a lot at stake and there's a lot going on in your life, So I think that's one of the reasons they can be hard, but it's probably one of the first times in my life I actually had a really strong sense of my own voice, and actually knowing exactly what I wanted to do and what my choice was going to be, so.
You are listening to All in the Mind with me, Sana Kadar. And this week, producer James Bullen with a story about big decisions, how we make them and how they shape us.
Sometimes the decisions we face are difficult but distinct, 2 or 3 choices, each with their pros and cons. But other decisions are out of our hands and can have a ripple effect on generations to come.
I was born in 1965, and in those times, unmarried pregnant women were not accepted in society. They weren't supported. They were advised by hospital staff that it would be better for their children if they were to give them up for adoption, and that a married couple would be a far better option for their babies. And if they really loved their babies and wanted the best for them, they would give them up. So that's what happened to my mother.
Anne is from Western Australia.
She wasn't allowed to see me, she wasn't allowed to hold me, she didn't feed me. She asked the staff repeatedly for me to be brought to her. This was denied to her, and eventually she was given an antipsychotic drug, I guess to subdue her so she'd stop asking for me and causing problems for the staff.
After a couple of weeks, Anne was taken home by her adoptive parents, but it wasn't a good fit.
I was a lonely child. I had a brother who was about 10 years older than me. My mother was always busy with housework and being a good housewife, that she didn't really have time. My father was a returned soldier. In hindsight, I think he had post-traumatic stress disorder, because he would be the kindest, gentlest man at one moment, and then the next moment he'd just explode. So you were just walking on eggshells all the time. Both my parents were emotionally distant, as I guess a lot of people of that generation were. They were both old enough to be my grandparents, so I kind of felt that distance as well. So old enough in age, but also old in attitude.
She always found herself wondering about her birth mother.
What she looked like. I used to scan crowds for her face. I used to think that, she would turn up one day. I couldn't understand how anyone could leave a baby. I wondered what was wrong with me, that she had left me. Obviously, I know now that that's a pretty common feeling amongst adoptees, and it's actually nothing, even if I know that I was very much wanted by her, but it's just a feeling that's sort of ingrained in you.
In her early 20s, Anne discovered that her birth mother wanted to make contact with her. Eventually, they got in touch.
So we spent an afternoon together, just talking, chatting, nothing too deep. It was a positive experience.
But the trauma of Anne's early years made it difficult to keep the relationship up, and they drifted apart. Finally, Anne made another very difficult decision.
I stopped corresponding with her for a while. It was just too hard. It was just too emotionally hard to deal with that. By that stage, I had been diagnosed with major depression and complex post-traumatic stress disorder. I was medicated and seeing a psychotherapist. I probably had pretty low self-esteem, so I was very wary of being in contact with her in case she rejected me. It's a core belief of mine that I'm an insignificant person, and I think a lot of that is to do with being given up for adoption. I say given up for adoption. I wasn't actually given up, I was stolen, but that feeling of rejection, that she might reject me again, and if she did that, it would really hurt. She was sort of the one person in the world that could really hurt me. So I was very wary of going down that track, but also I felt that I needed to. We're both getting on in years, and I thought, you just don't know, what's around the corner. You can lose people, and I didn't want to have regrets later down the track.
So there have been several studies where they ask people to tell them, what is the biggest regret you've ever made, or what's one of the most recent regrets you've made?
Dr. Adrian Camilleri is a consumer psychologist from the University of Technology, Sydney, who researches big decisions.
Commonly reported regrets relate to romance and family, and to some extent education. And another factor that seems to pop up here is this difference between inaction and action. So what types of decisions or actions do people tend to regret? Is it the things that they do or the things that they don't do? And in the short term, it turns out people tend to regret the things that they do. So, for example, making a regretful comment to a colleague, or maybe buying a boat that they never end up using. But over time, these feelings tend to fade. And what comes to the fore are the things that people didn't do they regret inaction. So maybe they regret not asking their colleague out, even though they really like them. Or maybe they regret not taking that trip to Peru and walking the Inca Trail when they were young and fit enough to actually do that. And I think one of the reasons for this is your mind can essentially use its imagination to think about alternate parallel universes, which you did make that decision. And when people make this kind of imagination, they think of all the positives and they tend to ignore all of the kind of unpleasant things. So, for example, I've walked the Inca Trail and I can tell you that most of the time my body was hurting. And so at the time, I may have been feeling some regret as to why am I climbing this huge hill day after day. But you don't know that when you haven't taken the action and you're just reflecting on the amazing parts of the experience that you've missed.
For Anne, the decision to get back in touch with her birth mother has helped her to grow and heal.
It means a lot. She fills a void that no one else can fill. She's my mother. We share DNA. I've got half of her DNA in my body. We are very alike. We like the same things. We think the same way. I feel very comfortable in her company because I feel that she understands me and I understand her. I didn't have that with my adopted family. I didn't feel that they understood me at all, and I certainly didn't understand them. Yeah, now we try to catch up a few times a year. It's been a bit challenging with state borders opening and closing because we live in different states. But we've managed to work around that. Yeah, it's pretty special being able to do that.
A decade ago, Australian author and palliative carer Bronnie Ware wrote a book about the regrets of the people she spoke to in her practice. Dr. Camilleri says these conversations had 5 key themes.
One of the most common regrets was I wish I'd had the courage to live a life true to myself and not the life others expected of me. And so it turned out a lot of the people she was working with just had felt obligated to live their life in a particular way. And as a result, they regretted not pursuing things, for example, like an education. Another one was I wish I hadn't worked so hard. And I think a lot of individuals regret not spending time with loved ones because they were working so hard. Another one was I wish I'd had the courage to express my feelings. Again, this is a regret related to inaction in terms of leading a genuine life and saying what you believe, again, perhaps because of obligation or social norms. Another one was I'd wish I'd stayed in touch with my friends. So a lot of the people that Bronnie was working with were older, and at this point they tended to be, I guess, a little bit lonely. And that's perhaps because they'd been working so much, not investing the time in maintaining those relationships. And then the final regret that she describes is I wish I'd had let myself be happier. This one's slightly difficult to communicate in a short amount of time, but I guess people were thinking about goals in their life and really not being happy with where they were now, but always constantly striving to get somewhere and sort of not stopping and I guess smelling the flowers of how great life is right now.
Someone who hasn't been afraid to take the plunge and live a life without regret is Kate Wildman from Queensland's Gold Coast.
I was 51 when I actually left Australia's shores, but I'd been a single mother for 25 years up till that point. Each night when I was going to bed, I'd be, like it's hard being a single mother. And so I'd have my dreams about, my life and what's it going to be like when I'm no longer raising children. So I conjured up this dream that one day I would go overseas.
With just a few $1,000s in savings, she decided to quit her job and leave Australia behind to go and live in Ireland at the age of 51.
I had a lot of naysayers, a lot of people saying, who are you going with? You can't do that on your own. I could never do that. I tried to convince them to dig deep into their own courage and that, you don't have to have this life. In your 50s, you can make any changes that you want. And then I realised that I was never going to convince anybody to do what I was doing. They saw me as crazy. They did see me as courageous, but there was half of them that probably thought, she won't last. She'll fail. She'll be back. And of course, I'm the kind of person too. I like to prove the naysayers wrong. So I knew I wasn't going to fail.
That mindset saw Kate on board the plane that would take her more than 17,000 kilometres from home. But once she'd boarded,
I kept thinking, what on earth am I doing? You don't know anybody over there. I was terrified. And I'm thinking, at what point can I get off this plane? And I thought, no. I was just, even though I was in tears, nearly quite hysterical, I just said, no, this is what you want to do. You can't go back. There's no going back. So I cried from Brisbane to Singapore. I had a German woman sitting beside me on the flight. She had no English, I had no German. But she saw my distress and she just kept buying me whiskey. I think she was probably hoping I'd go to sleep so she wouldn't have to put up with my sniffle, crying.
by the time she'd made it to Ireland, she was in better spirits.
My mother's family left Ireland in 1839, but her maiden name was Hessian, and Hessian is a very Galwegian name. So when I arrived, I went straight to the little village that my mother's family came out of, a little place called Tuam, Tuam. And I was there a couple of days and I thought, how do I find if there's any of my mother's family still in this village?
Kate went to the local history group and they published her story in the paper. And after that...
Well, I was inundated with Hessians from this little village. So the history group helped me go through them all, because a lot of them, and this was hysterical, a lot of them were bachelor farmers, of course. See? So they contacted me wanting to meet me, and a woman from Australia, and bachelor farmers over there are always looking for a wife, I found out. So these lovely people went through all the applicants and chose a few that they thought were possibilities.
Thanks to those helpful bachelor farmers, Kate eventually tracked down a distant relative and a new family of sorts.
Because I was embraced by this Hessian family who really believed I was one of theirs. And I had so many welcome home parties, James, even though my family left in 1839. But that's a real indicator of the Irish, really, and how welcoming they are. They were amazing.
Kate ended up spending 8 years in Europe, jumping from Ireland to Sweden to the United Kingdom. And she says that big decision to uproot and move her entire life overseas changed the way she saw the world.
I arrived in Ireland like a ship that had been on the high seas, being tossed and turned. And I had barnacles all over me, and I came into the safe port of Galway for repairs. I felt like it completely renewed me. It healed me. It was like I was being anointed with their kindness. I've never known kindness like it, like kindness to strangers. And it made me reflect on how kind am I to strangers? Like, I wouldn't be mean to them, but if there was someone that came from another country, would I open up my doors? Would I loan them my car, put them on my car insurance, introduce them to all my friends? Like, would I do that? So I made a decision there and then that I always would.
Kate's decision to upend her life in Australia turned out to be a really good one. But that's with the benefit of hindsight. It took a leap of faith to get there. So how can we make better decisions ahead of time? Consumer psychologist Dr. Adrian Camilleri says his research points to a few things that people should consider.
There's probably 3 parts. Most people would think about the outcome. A decision is good if it leads to good things. And that's true, but I think that overlooks two other aspects. So one of them is a good process. So my definition of a good decision is one that uses a good process going in. And a lot of the research that I've done suggests that good process firstly involves knowing what your goals are. It's really hard to evaluate whether you've made a good decision if you don't actually know what your goals are, because let's say you're being offered two different jobs and one of them has a higher salary and one of them involves more travel, let's say. So they could be equally good. A good decision here depends on what you value, whether you are seeking a job that pays more or that's going to allow you to travel more. Consistent with that is knowing what your values are. So some decisions are going to potentially challenge your values. And if you don't know those upfront, then you might make a decision that you later regret based on the fact that it's violating some of your personal values. As I mentioned earlier, taking your time before making a decision and gathering as much information as possible, particularly seeking advice from those who have made the decision before. So I've mentioned big life decisions are fairly rare. And as a result, we don't get an opportunity to learn from our mistakes. We might buy a house once or twice in a lifetime. We might get married once or twice in a lifetime. So not many opportunities to course correct, but these things are very common. People get married every day. People buy houses every day. So getting advice from those who have made the decision before is another great step in producing a good process. As I said, using a more analytical approach. And then the third aspect of a good decision, so firstly, having a good process, getting a good outcome, is I think minimizing regret after the decision outcome. And research that I've read suggests that the best way to minimize feelings of regret down the road is to use a good process up front. Because even if things turn out poorly, you can always tell yourself, well, you know what, based on what I knew at the time and based on my values at the time, my goals at the time, I made the best decision at the time. Sure, it didn't work out and I wish the outcome was different, but I really don't have anything to regret right now. So I think it's important to think about all three of those elements of a good decision.
After 8 years in Europe, Kate returned home to the Gold Coast to spend more time with her children and grandkids. But the decisions she made, as well as the other people I spoke to for this episode, have changed them.
I'm living a completely different lifestyle than I would have lived if I'd have stayed. So I guess if anything, I really want to encourage women that when your children leave home, it's then time for you to work out what you want to do. You don't have to settle. You can shake your whole life upside down. You've just got to dig into that courage that you've had all your life and design the life that you want to live.
Yes, do your research, listen to the experts on you, like your friends, as well as the experts medically and those kinds of things. But at the end of the day, listen to yourself and what you need and ask for what you need. If you need more time, ask for it. Because it's an extraordinary experience to really listen to yourself and find out, what's important to you.
That's Megan ending that story from All in the Mind producer James Bullen. You also heard from Dr. Adrian Camilleri, a senior lecturer from the University of Technology, and decision makers Anne and Kate Wildman. Our sound engineer this week was Timothy Jenkins. I'm Sana Kadar. Thanks for listening. Catch you next time.